The air hung heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, a familiar embrace for Elara. It was the kind of silence that wasn't empty but teeming with the whispers of the forest, a silence she had grown to cherish since moving to the remote cabin on the edge of the sprawling national park. Her only constant companion, a shaggy, golden retriever mix named Barnaby, was usually her shadow, a comforting presence as she navigated the solitude of her new life. But today, Barnaby was an anomaly, his usual gentle demeanor replaced by an unsettling agitation. His low, guttural whimpers and the way his fur bristled on his back were a stark contrast to his normally placid nature. He paced frantically by the back door, nose pressed against the glass, letting out a series of short, sharp barks that echoed through the otherwise still cabin. Elara, a woman in her late 30s with eyes that held a hint of a past sadness, usually found solace in routine. Her days were a simple rhythm of tending her small garden, reading by the crackling fire, and long, meandering walks with Barnaby through the labyrinthine trails that crisscrossed the forest. Today, however, that rhythm was shattered. Barnaby's distress wasn't just unusual. It was unnerving. He was a dog of habit, predictable, and his current behavior screamed that something was profoundly wrong outside. She tried to calm him, running a hand through his thick fur, her voice a soft murmur, but he was beyond comfort. His fixation was absolute, his gaze locked on the dense foliage beyond the porch. Finally, with a sigh that carried a weight she herself couldn't quite decipher, Elara clipped on his leash, a decision she would replay in her mind countless times in the days and weeks to come, each replay laced with a chilling mixture of regret and an unshakable sense of destiny. The forest, usually a sanctuary, felt different that afternoon. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, deeper, and the rustling of leaves underfoot sounded less like the gentle whisper of nature and more like hushed secrets being exchanged. Barnaby, typically a leisurely explorer, tugging gently on his leash, was now a determined force, pulling Elara deeper into the woods with an urgency that left her breathless. He wasn't following a scent trail. He was driven by something unseen, something only he seemed to perceive. His powerful strides took them off the familiar path, through thickets of thorny bushes that snagged at her clothes, and over moss-covered roots that threatened to trip her. Elara, despite her growing unease, held on tight, a strange mixture of apprehension and an inexplicable curiosity compelling her forward. What could possibly have spooked her usually unflappable companion to such an extreme? The question gnawed at her, a low hum beneath the rising crescendo of her own heartbeat. They had been walking for what felt like an eternity, the late afternoon sun beginning to dip below the towering canopy, casting the forest floor in an eerie twilight glow. Elara's legs ached, and her breath hitched in her throat, not just from the exertion but from the increasing sense of dread that permeated the air. Barnaby suddenly stopped, his body rigid, a low growl rumbling in his chest. He was staring intently at something nestled amongst a cluster of ancient oak trees, partially obscured by a fallen log and a dense patch of ferns. Elara squinted, trying to pierce the gathering gloom. At first, she saw nothing but the deepening shadows, the gnarled roots of the oaks twisting like skeletal fingers from the earth. Then, a flicker of movement, a splash of color that shouldn't have been there, caught her eye. It was a small, vibrant patch of red against the muted greens and browns of the forest, a stark, almost violent contrast. As they drew closer, the shape began to resolve itself. It wasn't an animal. It was too still, too small. A shiver traced its way down Elara's spine, an instinctive alarm bell clanging in her mind. Barnaby, still growling, began to whine, a soft, mournful sound that was utterly unlike him. And then, she saw it clearly. Curled in a fetal position, half hidden by the ferns, was a child. A little girl, no older than 5 or 6, clad in a bright red hooded jacket, her tiny frame utterly motionless. Her skin was pale, almost translucent in the dim light, and her light brown hair, matted with leaves and twigs, framed a face smudged with dirt and tear streaks. Elara's breath caught in her throat. A lost child. Here, in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest road, deep within the unforgiving embrace of the wilderness. How was this possible? Her mind reeled, a whirlwind of panicked thoughts. Who was this child? Where were her parents? Had she wandered off? Or was something far more sinister at play? The forest, which moments ago had felt merely unsettling, now radiated an ominous aura, the silence pressing in on her, amplifying the frantic thud of her own heart. She dropped Barnaby's leash, her hands trembling as she knelt beside the tiny figure. As she reached out a hesitant hand, a sudden, soft whisper broke the profound silence, a voice so small it was almost swallowed by the rustling leaves. Yet it struck Elara with the force of a physical blow. The child stirred, her eyes fluttering open, a startling shade of blue, wide and innocent, yet holding a depth of understanding that sent a cold dread through Elara. And then, with a voice barely above a breath, a voice that seemed to echo from a place beyond this forest, beyond this world, the little girl spoke a single word, a word that ripped Elara's carefully constructed reality to shreds, a word that should have been impossible. Elara. The single word, Elara, hung in the damp forest air, a fragile, impossible sound that echoed not just in her ears but deep within the forgotten chambers of Elara's own memory. It was a word spoken by a child she had never seen, in a place she had never expected to find anyone, let alone someone who knew her name. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror and disbelief. How could this be? She hadn't lived in this remote corner of the world for long, a self-imposed exile from a life she desperately wanted to forget, a life that had ended in a way no one should ever experience. Her past was buried, meticulously so, under layers of silence and distance. Yet, this tiny, frail child, lost and alone in the wilderness, spoke her name with a certainty that was utterly, profoundly disturbing. Elara knelt, her hands hovering, afraid to touch, afraid to break the fragile spell that seemed to hold them. Barnaby, who had been growling moments before, now sat quietly beside her, his head cocked, his dark eyes fixed on the child with an almost human concern. The little girl, her name still unknown, blinked slowly, her startling blue eyes seeming to pierce through Elara, seeing something beyond the surface. Are you okay?" Elara finally managed to whisper, her voice raspy, a stark contrast to the calm she desperately tried to project. The child simply gazed at her, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips, a smile that seemed too knowing, too ancient for such a young face. It was then, as Elara studied her, that she noticed the small, intricate silver locket clutched in the child's tiny hand, glinting dully in the fading light. It was an antique piece, etched with what looked like an old, forgotten symbol, and a cold dread began to coil in Elara's stomach. The journey back to the cabin was a blur of heightened senses and profound disorientation. The little girl, whom Elara had carefully wrapped in her own worn jacket, was surprisingly light, almost ethereal in her arms. She hadn't said another word after that initial, unnerving utterance of Elara's name, but her presence was a heavy weight, a silent question mark in the oppressive quiet of the forest. Barnaby trotted faithfully by their side, his earlier agitation replaced by a vigilant watchfulness. His ears perked, his nose twitching, as if sensing something Elara couldn't. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent a jolt of fear through Elara. The comforting familiarity of the woods had vanished, replaced by an oppressive, suffocating dread. She felt watched, a primal instinct screaming that they were not alone, that something unseen was following them, lurking in the ever-deepening shadows. Once inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire and the familiar scent of wood smoke did little to dispel the chilling atmosphere the child had brought with her. Elara gently placed the girl on the old plush armchair by the hearth. In the soft glow, she could finally get a clearer look. The child's clothes, though muddy and torn, seemed to be of good quality, the red jacket surprisingly warm. Her small hands were chapped and scratched, but otherwise, there were no obvious signs of serious injury. She looked underfed, her cheeks hollow, but her eyes, those unervingly intelligent blue eyes, held no fear, only a strange, unsettling calmness. Elara offered her warm water and a piece of bread, which the child accepted silently, eating with a deliberate slowness that spoke of both hunger and an almost unnatural composure. "What's your name, sweetie?" Elara asked gently, trying to keep her voice steady. The child looked up, her blue eyes locking onto Elara's with an intensity that made Elara shiver. A long moment passed, filled only by the crackling of the fire and the soft breathing of Barnaby beside them. Then, in a voice that was still a whisper but carried an unnerving clarity, the child replied, "Lily, just Lily. No surname, no details of where she came from." Elara tried to prod, to ask about her parents, how she ended up in the forest, but Lily merely shook her head, her gaze unwavering, her lips sealed. It was as if she had told Elara all she intended to, and no further questions would yield answers. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with unspoken questions and a growing sense of foreboding. As the evening wore on, Elara found herself pacing, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. Lily sat motionless in the armchair, observing everything with an unnerving stillness. She didn't ask for toys. She didn't cry for her parents. She didn't seem to want anything beyond the quiet warmth of the cabin. It was utterly abnormal for a child of her age. And then, as Elara was preparing a makeshift bed for her, she heard a soft, melodic hum coming from the living room. It was Lily, humming a lullaby, a hauntingly beautiful tune that Elara dimly recognized from somewhere deep in her own childhood, a melody that brought with it a wave of nostalgic sadness she couldn't quite place. It was a tune her own mother used to hum, a melody long forgotten, buried under years of grief and avoidance. How could Lily know that song? It wasn't a popular tune. It was an obscure, almost forgotten folk song from a small, distant town. A cold dread spread through Elara. This wasn't just a lost child. This was something else. Something impossible. Lily's eyes, her knowledge of Elara's name, the locket with its strange symbol, and now this ancient, personal lullaby. It was too much. Her past, the one she had painstakingly tried to erase, felt like it was clawing its way back to the surface, pulled by this ethereal child. Every instinct screamed at Elara to call the authorities, to report the child, to remove this unsettling enigma from her life. But something held her back. A strange, inexplicable pull towards Lily, a feeling that she was meant to find this child, that their paths were intrinsically linked, perhaps even destined. And beneath that, a chilling realization. What if reporting Lily wasn't the solution? What if doing so only opened the door to something far more terrifying? Something that had been waiting patiently in the shadows for years, finally stirring to life with the discovery of Lily. The night was long, filled with the unsettling sounds of the forest and the silent, unnerving presence of the child named Lily, who knew her name, and a song from a forgotten past. The following days blurred into a waking nightmare for Elara. Lily remained an enigma, a silent, unnerving presence in the small cabin. She ate little, spoke less, and spent most of her time gazing out the window into the dense, silent forest, as if waiting for something. Her unnerving calmness never wavered, even when Elara tried, again and again, to coax more information from her. "Where are your parents, Lily? How did you get here? Do you remember anything before Barnaby found you?" Each question was met with the same unwavering, knowing blue eyes, and then a slow, deliberate shake of her head. It was as if Lily existed outside the realm of normal human interaction, a ghost in the flesh. But the silence was far from empty. The cabin, once a haven of quiet solitude, began to hum with an unsettling energy. Objects would shift, a book she'd left on the table would appear on a different shelf. A blanket draped over the sofa would be neatly folded. At first, Elara dismissed it as her own tired mind playing tricks, or perhaps Barnaby nudging things. But the incidents grew more frequent, more precise. A delicate porcelain teacup, a cherished heirloom from her grandmother, was found shattered on the floor one morning, even though it had been placed securely on a high shelf the night before. There was no sign of a struggle, no paw prints from Barnaby, just the scattered shards reflecting the pale morning light, a chilling testament to an unseen presence. The true terror, however, began with the whispers. At first, they were barely audible, faint murmurs carried on the wind, just outside the cabin walls. Elara would dismiss them as the creaking of old timber or the rustling of leaves. But soon they grew clearer, distinct, though still just at the edge of comprehension. They were voices not quite human, undulating and echoing, sometimes sounding like children's laughter, sometimes like sorrowful cries. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, weaving through the forest, pressing against the windows, slipping under the door. Barnaby would growl, a deep, resonant sound, his hackles raised, staring intently at empty spaces that Elara could only perceive as unsettling silence. His fear, so palpable, validated her own growing terror. One particularly stormy night, with rain lashing against the cabin and wind howling like a tormented spirit, the whispers turned into a chorus. They weren't outside anymore. They were inside. They filled the small living room, swirling around Elara, a cacophony of disembodied voices, mournful and pleading. She clutched Barnaby tightly, her breath catching in her throat, her eyes wide with terror. Lily, meanwhile, sat in her armchair, perfectly still, her blue eyes glowing faintly in the dim light, a serene, almost triumphant expression on her face. She hummed, a low, melodic tune that somehow seemed to amplify the spectral voices, intertwining with them, a conductor to an orchestra of the damned. It was the same lullaby, the one from Elara's childhood, twisted now into something sinister. As the voices swirled, fragmented images began to flash in Elara's mind, vivid and terrifying. A dark, winding path through a dense forest, a fleeting glimpse of a small hand, grasping at a gnarled tree root, a chilling echo of a child's cry, abruptly cut short. These weren't her memories, or at least, not ones she consciously remembered. They felt ancient, primal, bleeding into her consciousness, bringing with them a profound sense of loss and despair. And with each fleeting image, a word would solidify in her mind. A name, Eleanor. The name felt like a thorn in her brain, pricking at a wound she didn't know she had. Who was Eleanor? Why did that name feel so significant, so deeply unsettling? Lily stopped humming. The voices in the room immediately ceased, leaving behind an aching, heavy silence. Lily slowly turned her head, her unnerving blue eyes fixing on Elara. A faint smile, more chilling than any scream, touched her lips. Eleanor, Lily whispered, her voice clear and resonant, completely unlike the quiet, almost ethereal tone she usually employed. She was waiting for you, all this time. The words hit Elara like a physical blow. Eleanor, the name she had just thought of, the name that felt so deeply connected to these terrifying visions. Lily knew. She knew everything. The air in the cabin grew cold, a biting chill that went straight to Elara's bones. Despite the roaring fire, she felt a profound, horrifying connection to this child, one that transcended logic and reason. It was as if Lily was a key, unlocking a forgotten chamber in Elara's own mind, a chamber filled with suppressed memories, with a past so terrible she had subconsciously sealed it away. The silver locket that Lily still clutched, now more visible in the eerie stillness, seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light, the ancient symbol on it somehow resonating with the very fabric of the cabin, the very air in the forest. Elara felt a terrifying understanding begin to dawn, a truth too monstrous to comprehend. This was not just a lost child. This was a manifestation, a ghost, perhaps even a vengeful spirit, connected to something deeply, tragically personal in Elara's own past. And the forest, she realized with a cold dread, was not just a place where Lily was found. It was the keeper of a terrible secret, a secret that was now relentlessly seeking its release, using Lily as its conduit, slowly, deliberately, consuming Elara's sanity. One whispered word, one shattered teacup, one haunting lullaby at a time. The single word, Eleanor, hanging in the air from Lily's lips, shattered Elara's world more completely than any physical force ever could. It wasn't just a name. It was a key, twisting in a lock she hadn't known existed, a floodgate of fragmented memories, long suppressed and buried under layers of trauma and self-preservation, burst forth with terrifying clarity. The dark path in the forest, the small hand, The chilling cry, they weren't just visions. They were fragments of a horrific truth Elara had desperately tried to bury. A truth about a sister, her younger sister, Eleanor. Eleanor, with her bright, mischievous eyes and a spirit as wild as the untamed forest they grew up beside. Eleanor, who had vanished without a trace 40 years ago, on a day that had ripped Elara's family apart. A day when Elara, barely a teenager herself, was supposed to be watching her. The guilt had been a lifelong companion, a silent, corrosive poison that had driven her to this remote cabin, hoping to outrun the echoes of that day. Now, those echoes were embodied in a child who called herself Lily, a child who knew Elara's deepest, most agonizing secret. As the realization slammed into her, the cabin seemed to warp around Elara. The air grew heavy, thick with unseen presences. The whispers, though silent now, reverberated in her mind, forming coherent sentences, mournful laments, and desperate pleas. They were the voices of the forest, the echoes of those who had been lost, and now, finally, the voice of Eleanor herself. It wasn't a spectral moan. It was a clear, young voice, filled with both sorrow and a profound, aching love, a love that transcended time and death. Lily, still seated in the armchair, seemed to glow with an inner light, her eyes fixed on Elara with an intensity that burned. The silver locket in her hand pulsed, emitting a soft, ethereal hum. As Elara watched, transfixed, the locket opened slowly, revealing not a picture, but a tiny, shriveled dried flower of forget-me-not. And then, as if by an unseen force, images began to swirl within the locket's tiny frame, like a flickering old film reel. Elara saw a young girl, undeniably Eleanor, playing in the very woods outside, her red jacket a vibrant splash against the green. She saw Eleanor wandering deeper, captivated by a butterfly, straying from the path. She saw the sudden, chilling realization in Eleanor's eyes as she became truly lost. And then darkness, a chilling, all-consuming darkness, not of death, but of endless wandering, a spirit trapped, unable to find its way home. Lily wasn't just a child Elara found. She was Eleanor, or at least, a manifestation of her spirit, drawn back by the very place of her disappearance, seeking a resolution, seeking peace. The forest hadn't just yielded a lost child. It had returned a lost soul, a piece of Elara's own shattered past, waiting patiently to be found, to be acknowledged. Barnaby, sensing the spiritual intensity in the room, whined softly, pressing against Elara's leg, his comforting presence an anchor in the storm of her unraveling reality. Tears streamed down Elara's face, not tears of terror, but of profound grief and a strange, overwhelming relief. 40 years of crushing guilt, of unanswered questions, of a gaping void in her soul, suddenly had an explanation, a voice, a presence. Lily, or Eleanor, reached out a tiny hand, beckoning. Elara, no longer afraid, moved towards her, kneeling before the armchair, her heart aching with a love she had thought was lost forever. As their hands touched, a wave of warmth enveloped Elara, a feeling of peace unlike anything she had ever known. The cabin filled with a soft, comforting light, and the whispers, now clearer, were no longer mournful but comforting, like a gentle breeze passing through leaves. In that moment, Elara understood. Eleanor hadn't been waiting for revenge or anger. She had been waiting for understanding, for peace, for her sister to find her, to finally acknowledge the truth of that day. The forest, a silent witness for decades, had finally given up its secret, not to torment, but to heal. As the light intensified, Lily's form shimmered, becoming translucent, and then, slowly, she faded, leaving behind only the faint scent of pine and wild honeysuckle, and the silver locket, now lying open on the armchair, its forget-me-not glowing with a soft, ethereal light. Elara picked up the locket, its warmth radiating into her palm. The guilt didn't vanish entirely. It transformed into a quiet sorrow, tempered by the profound peace that Eleanor had finally found, and the knowledge that she had, at last, truly found her sister. The forest outside no longer felt ominous. It felt like a sacred place, a resting ground. Barnaby nudged her hand, looking up at her with soft, understanding eyes, as if he too had witnessed the profound reunion. Life in the cabin continued, but it was changed. Elara no longer felt haunted. She felt healed. The whispers, if they came, were now gentle, comforting reminders of Eleanor's presence, not terrifying omens. She found a quiet strength she hadn't known she possessed, a resilience forged in the crucible of this impossible encounter. She knew this story was extraordinary, perhaps unbelievable to many, but it was her truth, a journey from profound loss to a peace she had never dreamed possible. And that's where we leave Elara's incredible journey, a tale of the unexplained, of lost souls, and the enduring power of family, even across the veil of time. If this story touched you, if it sent shivers down your spine and left you wondering about the secrets that lie hidden just beyond our sight, then don't forget to like this video. Your support helps us bring more chilling and thought-provoking tales like Elara's to you. And if you're new here, or if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on those notification bells so you don't miss a single one of our future explorations into the mysterious and the macabre. We have so many more stories waiting to be told, and you won't want to miss what we uncover next. Thank you for watching and stay curious.